The ground shook before the sirens even started. Grace Bellamy dropped the tray of medical supplies she was carrying and grabbed the nearest wall as dust rained down from the ceiling of the underground shelter. Somewhere above her, on the surface of the colony called New Halden, the sky had turned orange with fire. 3 minutes earlier, everything had been normal. Farmers were tending crops under the twin suns. Children were walking to the learning center. Traders were unloading crates at the small landing pad. Then the alarms tore through the peaceful morning, and every screen in the colony lit up with the same warning. Unknown vessels detected. Unknown vessels descending. All citizens to shelter immediately. New Halden had been built on the promise of a quiet life. 15 years earlier, a small group of settlers had left the crowded core worlds behind, drawn by open land, clean water, and the chance to build something of their own, away from the noise of the inner systems. The colony had grown slowly but steadily, its people learning to trust the rhythm of the twin suns and the gentle predictability of their days. None of them had ever imagined a morning like this one. Grace was the colony's administrator, which meant that in moments like this, she was also its leader, whether she wanted the job or not. She pressed her hand against her earpiece and tried to raise anyone on the surface channel. Static answered her, then a voice, breathless and shaking. "Grace, they're here. They're already here. I don't know what they are. I've never seen anything like them. They're just walking through the fences, like they aren't even there." The voice belonged to Nathan Cole, head of the colony's small security team, a group of 8 people whose main job until today had been chasing wild grazers off the crop fields. Nothing in his training had prepared him for creatures with armored shells and long silver limbs marching out of ships that had appeared from nowhere. Grace ran toward the security monitors at the end of the shelter hallway, her boots slapping against the metal floor. On the screen she saw them for the first time. Tall, narrow figures, moving in perfect lines, their bodies covered in plates that shimmered faintly blue. They did not run, they did not shout, they simply advanced, calm and steady, toward the heart of the colony. "How many?" she said into her earpiece, though she already knew the answer would not help her feel better. "I count at least 60 on this side alone," Nathan answered. "Maybe more coming from the eastern ridge. Grace, we can't fight this. We have hunting rifles and a handful of stun batons. These things aren't even flinching when we shoot at them." Behind Grace, more colonists poured into the shelter, faces pale, children clutching the hands of parents who did not know what to tell them. An older man named Henry Voss, who had lived on New Halden since it was founded 15 years ago, pushed his way to Grace's side. "What do we do?" he asked quietly, so the children nearby would not hear the fear in his voice. Grace did not have an answer yet. She turned back to the screen, just as one of the alien figures raised an arm, and a beam of energy cut across the security camera's view, turning it to static. The picture was gone. All she had now was Nathan's voice, growing more distant and more afraid with every passing second. "They're taking the water station," Nathan said. "They're taking the grain stores. I don't think they're here to destroy us, Grace. I think they're here to take everything we have." That thought was almost worse. An enemy that wanted to destroy them was frightening, but an enemy that wanted to strip them of everything and leave them with nothing meant a much longer, much crueler kind of suffering. More colonists arrived at the shelter with each passing minute, some carrying only what they had grabbed in the first seconds of panic. A young mother clutched a sleeping infant against her chest, her eyes wide and unfocused. An elderly couple moved slowly down the shelter stairs, supported on either side by neighbors who had stopped to help them despite their own fear. Grace counted faces as they entered, doing the only thing she could think to do in that moment, making sure no one was left behind on the surface. "Is this everyone from the Eastern District?" she called out to a young farmhand named Owen Price, who had helped lead a group of families down from the outer fields. "I think so," he answered, breathless from the run. There were a few families still working the far crops when the alarm went off. I don't know if they made it to the western shelter in time. Grace felt her stomach tighten at the thought of colonists still caught somewhere on the surface, unaccounted for and alone. She made a note to ask Nathan's team to check on the western shelter the moment there was a break in the fighting, though she had no idea when, or if, that moment would come. Grace made her decision in an instant. She turned to the young woman running the shelter's communication desk, a technician named Ellen Ward who had barely finished her training 6 months earlier. "Send the distress signal," Grace said. "Full priority, every frequency we have. Tell them New Halden is under attack by an unknown force, and we need help now." Ellen's hands trembled as she typed the command, but her voice was steady when she asked, "Where do we even send it? We're on the edge of nowhere. It could take days, weeks, for anyone to even hear it." "Send it anyway," Grace said. "Someone out there is listening. Someone has to be." Ellen nodded and activated the transmitter. A soft hum filled the small communication room as the signal launched outward into the darkness of space, carrying with it a simple, desperate message. "New Halden colony under attack. Unknown alien force. Civilians trapped. Please respond." While the signal traveled outward at the speed of light, the situation on the surface grew worse by the minute. Nathan and his small team retreated from the water station, falling back toward the main square, where more colonists were still trying to reach the shelter entrance. The alien soldiers did not chase them with urgency. They simply continued their steady advance, as if certain that resistance was pointless and speed was unnecessary. One of Nathan's team members, a young farmer named Marcus Doyle who had only picked up a rifle for the first time that morning, tried firing at the nearest alien figure from behind a stack of grain crates. The shot struck the creature's shoulder plate and bounced away harmlessly, leaving not even a scratch. The alien turned its head toward Marcus, slow and deliberate, and for a moment, Marcus felt certain he was about to die. Instead, the creature simply continued walking past him, toward the grain stores, as if he were nothing more than an insect buzzing near its ear. "They're not even trying to kill us," Marcus said into his earpiece, his voice shaking. "It's like we're not even worth their attention." Nathan felt a chill at those words. An enemy that saw them as beneath notice was, in its own way, more terrifying than one that saw them as a threat. Down in the shelter, Grace paced back and forth, while Ellen monitored the transmitter, praying for any sign of a response. Henry Voss sat with a group of children, telling them a story about the early days of the colony, to keep their minds off the shaking ground and the muffled sounds of chaos above them. Grace admired him for it. In the middle of terror, he was still finding a way to offer comfort. An hour passed. Then two. The alien forces continued moving through the colony above, taking supplies, taking equipment, taking anything of value, while the people of New Halden waited in the dark, unsure if help was coming, or if they would simply be forgotten out here on the edge of known space. Inside the shelter, the waiting had its own kind of weight. Children grew tired of Henry's stories and began asking the questions their parents had been dreading. Questions about when they could go home, about whether their pets and belongings would still be there when this was over. Grace moved among the colonists as best she could, offering quiet reassurance where she had little real comfort to give, and checking in with Ellen every few minutes to see if anything new had come through on the emergency channel. Nathan's voice returned periodically with updates from the surface, each one delivered in the hushed, careful tone of someone trying not to be overheard by an enemy that might be listening. He reported that the alien forces had expanded their perimeter to include the fuel depot and the colony's small transport hangar, and that at least 2 more landing craft had touched down on the eastern ridge since the attack began. Whatever this invasion was, it did not appear to be slowing down. "They're building something near the landing pad," Nathan said at one point, his voice tight with confusion. "Some kind of structure, going up fast. I don't know what it's for, but it doesn't look temporary." Grace relayed the information to Ellen, who noted it carefully, uncertain if it would matter to whoever eventually responded to their call, but unwilling to leave out any detail that might help. The uncertainty of not knowing what was happening above ground, combined with the growing fear of what might come next, made every minute of waiting feel like an hour of its own. Then, just as Grace was beginning to lose hope, Ellen's console let out a soft chime, a response. Grace rushed to her side, and together they read the message that had come back across the void of space. Faint, but unmistakably real. "Signal received. Terran Expeditionary Fleet Vessel, Horizon's call en route. Estimated arrival, 18 hours. Hold position. Help is coming." Grace closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. 18 hours was a long time. 18 hours was an eternity, when alien soldiers were walking freely through your home. But it was something. It was hope. And right now, hope was the only weapon New Halden had left. She turned to the frightened faces around her, to Henry still comforting the children, to Ellen wiping tears of relief from her eyes, to Marcus and Nathan's voices still crackling nervously over the earpiece from the surface, and she said the only thing she could say. Help is coming. We just have to survive until they get here. Above them, the alien soldiers continued their slow, methodical march through New Halden, unaware that far across the stars, a Terran marine vessel had just changed course, engines burning hot, as it turned toward a distress signal it had no intention of ignoring. Colonel Daniel Ashford was reviewing supply reports in his quarters aboard the Horizon's Call when the alert came through. He had served in the Terran Marine Corps for over 20 years, and in that time he had learned to recognize the difference between routine alerts and the ones that mattered. This one mattered. He set down his datapad and answered the call before the second chime finished sounding. Ashford here. Colonel, you need to see this, said Captain Laura Whitfield, the ship's tactical officer, her voice tight with urgency. We just picked up a distress signal from a fringe colony called New Halden. Civilian settlement, minimal defenses, and they're reporting an active ground invasion by an unidentified alien force. Daniel was already moving toward the bridge before she finished speaking. The corridors of the Horizon's Call were narrow, built for efficiency rather than comfort, and his boots echoed against the metal floor as Marines and crew members stepped aside to let him pass. He had commanded this vessel for 4 years, and in that time he had led his Marines through pirate raids, rescue missions, and the occasional skirmish with hostile factions along the frontier. But an unidentified alien force was something new, something that sent a familiar tension coiling in his chest. When he reached the bridge, the main view screen already displayed a star map with New Halden's location marked in red. Laura stood beside the navigation console, her arms crossed, studying the readout with a focused expression that Daniel had come to trust over the years they had served together. Talk to me, Daniel said, stepping up beside her. New Halden is a mining and farming colony. About 400 civilians. No military presence to speak of, Laura said. They sent out a full priority distress call about 2 hours ago. The message says they're under attack by an alien force that isn't responding to weapons fire, and that the attackers seem to be stripping the colony of supplies rather than attacking the people directly. Any idea who they are? None, Laura admitted. No records in our database match the description. Whoever they are, this is the first time Terran forces have encountered them. Daniel felt the weight of that statement settle over the bridge. First contact was supposed to be a moment of careful diplomacy, cautious communication, months of preparation by specialized teams. Instead, it was happening in the middle of an attack on defenseless civilians, with 400 lives hanging in the balance and no time to prepare for what they might find. He thought back to the training simulations every Terran officer studied, the careful protocols for approaching an unknown species, the emphasis on patience and observation before any action was taken. Those protocols assumed time that Daniel simply did not have. Somewhere below the smoke rising from New Halden, real people were hiding in the dark, trusting that someone out among the stars had heard their call and would come. He was not going to let careful procedure cost them their lives. Pull up everything we have on unexplored contact protocols, he said to Laura. I want us prepared to communicate if the opportunity arises, not just to fight, but make no mistake. Our first priority is getting those civilians out safely, whatever that requires. How far are we from New Halden? He asked. At maximum safe speed, 18 hours, Laura said. We already sent a response to the colony confirming we're on our way. Good, Daniel said. Set course immediately. I want every Marine squad briefed and ready within the hour. If we're heading into a first contact situation with an armed alien force, I want us prepared for the worst possibility, while hoping for the best outcome. Laura nodded and began issuing the necessary orders to the navigation team. Within minutes, the Horizon's Call shifted course, its powerful engines flaring to life as it turned away from its previous patrol route and set a direct path toward New Halden. The ship trembled slightly as it accelerated, a familiar sensation to everyone aboard who had experienced the surge of an emergency response maneuver before. Daniel made his way to the briefing room, where his Marine squad leaders were already gathering, alerted by the ship-wide announcement that had gone out moments earlier. Sergeant Owen Marsh was the first to arrive, a broad-shouldered man with a calm, steady presence that Daniel had relied on through countless difficult missions. Owen had a habit of staying quiet during briefings until he had something important to say, and Daniel had learned over the years to always listen closely when he finally spoke. Following Owen were the rest of the squad leaders, including Sophie Lang, a sharp and quick-thinking officer who commanded the ship's reconnaissance team, and a handful of others whose faces Daniel had come to know well through years of service together. They took their seats around the briefing table as Daniel activated the display, showing New Halden's layout alongside the limited information they had about the attacking force. "Here's what we know," Daniel began. "A civilian colony called New Halden is under attack by an alien force we've never encountered before. They arrived without warning, and according to the distress signal, conventional weapons fire has had little to no effect against them. The colonists report that the attackers seem more interested in taking supplies than in causing direct harm to the population, but that could change at any moment, and we cannot assume it will remain that way." "Do we know their numbers?" Sophie asked, leaning forward with her characteristic intensity. "Unconfirmed," Daniel said. "The colony's security team estimated at least 60 in the area they observed, but the total force could be significantly larger. We should assume we are facing an organized and disciplined enemy, not a scattered raiding party." Owen finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "If our weapons are having trouble getting through their armor, we're going to need a different approach. Standard rifles might not cut it. I'd recommend we bring the heavier plasma cutters, along with the shielded assault gear, just in case we're dealing with something built to shrug off small arms fire." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Good thinking. I want full combat loadouts prepared. Heavy and light squads both. We don't know what we're walking into, so we prepare for every scenario we can imagine, and probably a few we can't." The briefing continued for the better part of an hour, as the Marines worked through contingency plans, evacuation routes for the civilians, and strategies for approaching an enemy whose strengths and weaknesses remained a mystery. Throughout it all, Daniel felt the familiar mix of tension and focus that came before every serious engagement. The sense of responsibility for the lives of his Marines weighed against the urgent need to protect the innocent people waiting for rescue on New Halden. A younger officer near the back of the room, a recent addition to the squad named Nathaniel Brooks, raised a hand hesitantly. "Colonel, if standard weapons aren't effective, is there a chance we're outmatched here? I mean truly outmatched, not just facing a tough fight." The room went quiet for a moment, the question hanging in the air. Daniel had learned over the years that pretending uncertainty did not exist rarely helped a squad function well under pressure. Better to acknowledge it honestly and let his Marines see that he had a plan regardless. "It's possible," Daniel admitted. "We don't have enough information yet to know for certain. But outmatched doesn't mean unbeatable, and it doesn't mean we walk away from 400 people who are counting on us. We adapt. We use every advantage available, and we watch for openings the enemy doesn't expect us to find. That's how we've won difficult fights before, and it's how we'll approach this one." Nathaniel nodded, seemingly steadied by the straightforward answer, and the briefing continued, moving into detailed discussion of formation strategies, fallback positions, and communication protocols that would keep every squad connected and coordinated once boots hit the ground on New Halden. As the hours passed and the Horizon's call raced toward its destination, reports began trickling in from the colony, relayed through Ellen Ward's steady stream of updates. The alien force had taken control of the water station and the grain stores. They had established what appeared to be a temporary base camp near the colony's landing pad. Most concerning of all, additional alien ships had been spotted descending from orbit, suggesting that the invading force was growing rather than shrinking. Daniel reviewed each update carefully, sharing the information with his squad leaders as it arrived. The picture forming in his mind was troubling. This did not look like a hit-and-run raid. It looked like the beginning of an occupation, a deliberate and organized effort to claim New Halden's resources, and possibly the colony itself. 6 hours before their scheduled arrival, Laura called Daniel back to the bridge with an urgent update. "Colonel, we're picking up something on long-range sensors. Looks like a fleet formation, moving through the same sector we're heading into." Daniel studied the sensor readout she displayed, his jaw tightening as he took in the scale of what they were seeing. A cluster of vessels, at least a dozen strong, moving in a pattern that suggested military coordination rather than civilian traffic. "Same origin as the ground forces on New Halden?" he asked. Signature matches what little data we have, Laura confirmed. It looks like reinforcements, Colonel. Whoever these people are, they're not planning a quick raid. They're settling in. Daniel felt the weight of the decision ahead of him pressing down on his shoulders. The Horizon's Call was a capable vessel, well armed and crewed by experienced Marines, but it was still a single ship facing what appeared to be a coordinated, growing enemy presence. Retreating and calling for reinforcements would take time they did not have, time that the people of New Halden could not afford to lose. Pressing forward alone carried significant risk, but turning back was not something Daniel was prepared to consider while 400 civilians remained in danger. "We continue on course," he said finally, "but I want every possible advantage we can find before we arrive. Sophie, I want your reconnaissance team analyzing every scrap of data we can gather on this alien fleet during the remaining hours. Owen, work with the squad leaders to adjust our combat plans based on what we're seeing. If we're facing a larger force than expected, we need to be smarter about how we engage them, not just stronger." The bridge crew moved into action, each person focused on their assigned tasks, as the Horizon's Call continued its determined journey toward New Halden. Daniel remained on the bridge, watching the star map as their positions slowly closed the distance toward the colony, his thoughts constantly returning to the 400 people waiting below, trusting that help would arrive before it was too late. As the final hours ticked away, Sophie's team managed to intercept fragments of communication, traveling between the alien vessels, though the language remained impossible to translate with the ship's limited database. Still, the tone and pattern of the transmissions told its own story, a steady, structured rhythm that suggested discipline and hierarchy rather than chaos. This was not a wild, uncontrolled force. It was an organized power, moving with purpose, and that realization only sharpened Daniel's resolve. During the final approach, Laura called Daniel aside once more, her expression troubled. "Colonel, I've been reviewing the transmission patterns from the alien fleet again. There's something odd. Not all of the signals match. It's subtle, but there appear to be two distinct communication styles moving through their network, almost like two separate groups operating under the same general presence." Daniel frowned, studying the data she displayed. "Two factions, maybe? Rival commanders?" "It's possible," Laura said. "Or it could be nothing, just noise in a language we don't understand yet. But if you're right, it might explain some of the strange behavior the colony reported. Soldiers advancing without urgency, then seeming to change tactics abruptly. That kind of inconsistency could mean divided leadership." Daniel filed the observation away, uncertain what to make of it yet, but grateful for anything that might help him understand the enemy waiting below. 2 hours before arrival, Daniel gathered his Marines one final time in the ship's launch bay, where the assault shuttles sat ready and waiting. He looked out over the assembled squads, dozens of men and women who had trained together, fought together, and trusted each other through every mission that had come before this one. He knew that whatever waited for them on New Halden, they would face it as they always had, together. "I won't pretend I know exactly what we're walking into," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the launch bay. "We've never faced an enemy like this before, but I do know this. There are 400 people down there who sent out a call for help, and we are the ones who answered. We are not going to let them down." A murmur of quiet determination passed through the assembled Marines, the kind of steady resolve that came not from bravado, but from genuine commitment to the mission ahead. Owen gave a firm nod from where he stood near the front of the group, and Sophie's usual sharp focus had settled into something calm and ready. As the Horizon's Call finally entered the outer edge of the New Halden system, the view screen filled with the sight of alien vessels positioned around the planet, their formation now clearly visible against the backdrop of stars. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself for what was about to come. "All squads, report to your shuttles," he ordered. "We're going in." The launch bay doors began to open, and the Marines moved with practiced efficiency toward their assigned shuttles, each person aware that the coming hours would test them in ways none of them could fully predict. Below them, on the surface of New Halden, Grace Bellamy and the frightened people of her colony continued to wait, unaware that the rescue they had prayed for was now only minutes away, and that it would arrive, not with an easy victory, but with a fight unlike anything the Terran Marines had ever faced before. The shuttle carrying Daniel Ashford and his lead squad dropped through New Halden's atmosphere faster than regulations normally allowed, but Daniel had made it clear before launch that speed mattered more than comfort on this run. Through the small viewport, he watched the colony grow larger below, smoke rising from several structures near the landing pad. Alien vessels scattered across the open fields where crops had once grown peacefully under the twin suns. 2 minutes to touchdown, the pilot called back over the comm. Owen Marsh sat across from Daniel, checking his weapon one final time, his expression calm despite the tension filling the shuttle. Around them, a dozen Marines sat in similar states of quiet readiness, each one running through their own private rituals before the chaos of ground combat began. Daniel had seen this same scene play out before countless missions, and yet it never failed to remind him of the weight resting on every person in the shuttle, the responsibility they carried for each other, and for the civilians waiting below. The shuttle shook as it broke through the lower atmosphere, and Daniel caught his first close view of the alien forces below. They moved in disciplined lines, exactly as the colony's reports had described, tall figures with plated bodies that caught the light in shifting shades of blue. There were more of them than he had expected, spread across the colony in coordinated groups rather than a single unorganized mass. "Landing zone is hot," Sophie Lang's voice cut through the comm from her own shuttle nearby. "I'm seeing at least 100 hostiles between us and the shelter entrance." "They're aware of our approach, Colonel. They're repositioning." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. First contact was rarely simple, but this was shaping into something far more complicated than a straightforward rescue. "Understood. All squads, prepare for immediate engagement on landing. Priority is reaching the shelter and securing the civilians. We hold defensive positions and avoid unnecessary escalation, unless directly threatened." The shuttle touched down hard on the outskirts of the colony, and the doors slid open to a scene of smoke and confusion. Daniel led his squad out first, weapon raised, scanning the area as his Marines fanned out behind him in practiced formation. The alien forces nearby noticed their arrival almost immediately, several of the tall figures turning toward the newly landed shuttles with slow, deliberate movements. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Marines held their position, weapons ready, but not firing, waiting to see how the aliens would respond to their sudden arrival. Daniel studied the nearest figures carefully, noting the way their heads tilted slightly, almost as if they were surprised, or perhaps simply curious, by the appearance of new arrivals. Then one of the alien figures raised its arm, and a beam of energy shot past Daniel's shoulder, striking the shuttle behind him with enough force to scorch the metal hull. "Contact! Take cover!" Daniel shouted, diving behind a nearby storage container as his Marines scattered for cover, weapons opening fire in response. The battle for New Halden had begun. Near the edge of the marketplace, a Marine named Ellis Whitmore took a glancing hit to the shoulder plating of his armor, the force of it spinning him around and knocking him against a low wall. Owen was at his side within seconds, dragging him back behind cover as a medic moved in to check the damage. "I'm fine, just knocked the wind out of me," Ellis grunted, pushing himself back up, despite the medic's protest, determined to stay in the fight alongside his squad. Owen gave him a firm nod and returned his attention to the battle unfolding around them, impressed as always by the resilience of the Marines under his command. The fighting that followed was unlike anything Daniel had experienced in over 20 years of service. The alien soldiers moved with unsettling calm even under heavy fire, their armored plates deflecting most standard weapons fire just as the colonists had warned. Owen's team, equipped with the heavier plasma cutters, managed to bring down several of the attackers, the intense heat of the weapons finally punching through the shimmering blue armor where standard rounds had failed. "Plasma weapons are effective," Owen called out, ducking behind a low wall as return fire scorched the ground near his position. "Standard rifles are basically useless against their armor, but the plasma cutters are getting through." Daniel relayed the information across all squads immediately, and the Marines began adjusting their tactics, falling back to let the heavier weapons teams take the lead, while lighter squads provided covering fire and flanking support. Slowly, methodically, the Marines began pushing forward through the colony, working their way toward the shelter where Grace Bellamy and the civilians waited. Progress was slow and costly. Every building the Marines cleared seemed to reveal another cluster of alien soldiers positioned just beyond it, and the narrow streets of the colony offered little room for the kind of wide flanking maneuvers that might have made the fighting easier. Sophie's reconnaissance team worked from a rooftop position, calling out enemy movements as they spotted them, giving the ground squads precious seconds of warning before each new engagement. "Colonel, I've got a group of maybe 15 hostiles regrouping near the old grain silo," Sophie reported. "They look like they're trying to cut off the route between your position and the shelter." "Copy that," Daniel replied, gesturing for his squad to shift direction. "We'll swing wide and hit them from the side rather than walking straight into it." The maneuver worked better than expected, the Marines catching the regrouping alien soldiers off guard and using the heavier plasma weapons to break their formation before they could mount an organized defense. It was a small victory in a battle that still had a long way to go, but it gave Daniel a growing sense that, difficult as this fight was proving to be, it was not unwinnable. As the fighting continued, Daniel noticed something strange about the way the alien forces were behaving. Despite their disciplined formations and clearly advanced technology, they seemed almost hesitant in certain moments, as though they were reluctant to press their advantage even when opportunities presented themselves. Several times, Daniel watched alien soldiers retreat from positions they could have easily held, falling back toward the center of the colony, rather than continuing to advance. "Something's off about their tactics," Daniel said over the comm, ducking beside Sophie as her squad linked up with his, near the colony's central square. "They're not fighting like an army trying to conquer this place. It's like they're just trying to hold on to what they've already taken." Sophie nodded, wiping sweat and dust from her forehead. "I noticed the same thing. My team intercepted a few more of their transmissions during the approach. The patterns changed the moment we landed. Before we arrived, their communications were calm and structured. Now they sound rushed, almost frantic." Before Daniel could respond, a new alien figure emerged from the smoke ahead of them, distinct from the others in both size and the ornate patterns etched into its armor. This one moved with obvious authority, and the surrounding alien soldiers immediately adjusted their formations to follow its lead. Daniel recognized command presence when he saw it, regardless of species. "That's their leader," Daniel said quietly, raising a hand to signal his Marines to hold position rather than open fire immediately. "Everyone hold! Let's see what happens!" The alien commander studied the assembled Marines for a long moment, its posture rigid, almost wary. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, it lowered the weapon it carried and raised both of its long arms in a gesture that, across countless species and cultures, seemed to universally signal the absence of hostile intent. "Colonel, is that what I think it is?" Owen asked quietly over the comm, his weapon still raised, but his finger resting carefully away from the trigger. "I think they're trying to communicate," Daniel said, slowly lowering his own weapon, though every instinct in his body urged caution. He stepped forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, aware of the risk he was taking, but equally aware that a chance at understanding was worth pursuing if it could bring an end to the violence. The alien commander watched him approach, remaining still, its long arms still raised. When Daniel stopped several paces away, the creature made a series of low, clicking sounds, followed by a gesture toward the colony around them, then toward its own soldiers, then back toward Daniel. "I don't understand you," Daniel said slowly, keeping his voice calm and even. "But I don't think you want to keep fighting either. Is that right?" The alien commander tilted its head again, that same gesture Daniel had noticed earlier, and then, unexpectedly, it reached toward a device mounted on its chest plate. Daniel tensed, ready to react, but Sophie's voice came through his earpiece a moment later. "Colonel, that's a translator device. Low grade, but it's picking up a language pattern. Give it a second." A crackling mechanical voice emerged from the device, broken and halting, but understandable. "We, not wish, fight. We, need, only need." Daniel felt a wave of surprise pass through him, quickly followed by cautious curiosity. "Need what?" he asked slowly, unsure if the translator would even convey his words back to the alien commander. There was a pause, then the device crackled again, as the alien commander spoke, its clicking language slowly being converted into broken but clear words. "Our world, dying. No water, no food. We search, many stars. Find nothing. Find this place. We take only what we must to survive. The weight of those words settled over Daniel, and he glanced back at Owen and Sophie, both of whom had lowered their weapons as they listened to the translated message. Around them, the sounds of battle elsewhere in the colony continued, but in this small clearing, a fragile moment of understanding had taken hold. Around them, the sounds of distant fighting continued in other parts of the colony, a reminder that not every alien soldier had received word of this fragile pause. Sophie kept a careful watch on the surrounding rooftops, her weapon ready, while Owen's voice occasionally broke through the calm with updates from the push toward the shelter, each report delivered in the clipped, focused tone of someone still very much in the middle of a fight. "You attacked innocent people," Daniel said carefully. "You could have asked for help instead." The alien commander's posture shifted, something that looked remarkably like shame passing through its rigid frame. "We tried, before. Other worlds, they attack first, destroy our ships. We learn. Take quickly, before attacked. Mistake. We see now, mistake." Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, though he remained cautious, aware that trust built in a single conversation could still be misplaced. If your people are truly starving, there are better ways to get help than attacking a defenseless colony. But right now, I need you to call off your forces. No more fighting. No more taking what isn't yours. The alien commander lowered its head slightly, a gesture that seemed to carry genuine understanding, and turned to relay something in its own language to the soldiers nearby. Slowly, across the colony, the sounds of battle began to fade as the alien forces received new orders, weapons lowering, aggressive formations dissolving into cautious retreat. But the moment of relief was short-lived. A sudden burst of energy fire erupted from the far side of the colony, followed by Sophie's urgent voice over the comm. "Colonel, we've got a problem. Not all of their forces are standing down. There's a second group, larger and more heavily armed, moving in from the eastern ridge. They're not responding to the commander's orders." Daniel's brief moment of hope curdled into fresh concern. He turned back to the alien commander, who appeared equally alarmed by this new development, its clicking language taking on an urgent, frantic edge as it spoke rapidly into its own communication device. "Explain," Daniel demanded, though the translator struggled to keep pace with the alien commander's rapid speech. Finally, broken words emerged. "Not my soldiers. Different group. Different leader. They do not want peace. They want everything. They will not stop." Daniel's mind raced as he processed this new complication. What had seemed like a single unified enemy force was actually divided, splintered between those desperate enough for peace and those determined to take by any means necessary. And now, this second, more dangerous faction was closing in on the colony, with the shelter full of civilians directly in their path. He thought back to Laura's earlier observation aboard the Horizon's call, the subtle difference in communication patterns she had detected in the alien fleet's transmissions. She had been right, and now Daniel understood exactly what that difference meant. The Korlathi were not a single united force marching against humanity. They were a desperate, fractured people, some willing to risk everything for a peaceful solution, others convinced that only strength and speed could save what remained of their dying world. Understanding that difference might be the key to ending this conflict without further bloodshed, but first, they had to survive the immediate threat bearing down on the colony. Vareth's soldiers moved quickly to help clear the path, their earlier hostility replaced now by an urgency that matched the Marines' own. Daniel found it strange, fighting alongside creatures who had been shooting at his squad only an hour before, but there was no time to dwell on the strangeness of the alliance. Every second mattered, and the shelter, along with everyone inside it, remained the priority above all else. "Owen, status on the shelter," Daniel called urgently. "We're close, Colonel. Maybe 200 meters out, but this new group is cutting off our direct route," Owen replied, his voice tight with focus. "If they reach the shelter before we do, I don't like our chances of stopping them from breaching it." Daniel turned back to the alien commander, making a decision he knew carried significant risk. "If you truly want peace, help us stop this second group. Fight alongside us, or at the very least, get your soldiers out of our way so we can protect the people in that shelter." The alien commander hesitated only a moment before nodding, a gesture Daniel hoped translated across species as clearly as it seemed to. The creature turned and issued rapid commands to the soldiers around it, and within moments, the alien forces that had originally attacked the colony began repositioning, not to continue their assault, but to help clear a path toward the shelter. "Move now!" Daniel shouted to his Marines, breaking into a run toward the shelter with Owen and Sophie's squads falling in alongside him. Smoke filled the air around them as they pushed forward through the colony, the sounds of the approaching second alien force growing louder with every passing second, a reminder that the true battle for New Halden's survival was only just beginning. They passed the scorched remains of the marketplace stalls, the abandoned water station where the invasion had first taken hold that morning, and the grain stores that had been stripped nearly bare by the desperate Korlathi forces. Every step brought them closer to the shelter, and closer to the second wave of fighting that Daniel knew was now unavoidable. He glanced sideways at Vareth, running alongside the Marines with a speed that belied its earlier calm, calling out instructions to its own soldiers as they moved to secure the flanks of the advancing group. "How much time do we have?" Daniel called out to Sophie, who was monitoring the approaching enemy formation from a small scanning device strapped to her wrist. "Not much," she answered. "They'll reach the shelter's outer perimeter within minutes, if we don't intercept them first." Daniel pushed his pace faster, his Marines matching his urgency, boots pounding against the scorched ground of New Halden, as the colony's fate hung in the balance once again, this time not from the invaders who had started the day's chaos, but from those among them who refused to accept anything less than total conquest. Grace Bellamy felt the shelter shake harder than it had all day, and this time the tremors did not fade quickly. Ellen Ward looked up from her console, her face pale in the dim emergency lighting. "Something's happening up there," Ellen said. "The readings are spiking. Whatever is fighting on the surface right now, it's close, and it's getting closer." Grace moved toward the shelter's reinforced door, listening to the muffled sounds of distant explosions and the occasional sharp crack of weapons fire. Henry Voss remained with the children near the back of the shelter, his calm storytelling voice never wavering even as fear tightened every other face in the room. Grace admired his composure and tried to draw some of it into herself as she turned to address the frightened colonists gathered around her. A sharp knock echoed against the shelter's outer door, 3 short raps followed by a pause, then 2 more, the emergency signal Nathan had arranged with Grace before the fighting began. Grace hurried to the small viewing panel and felt a wave of relief wash over her at the sight of Owen Marsh's Marines standing outside, weapons lowered, faces streaked with dust and sweat, but unmistakably human. "Open it," Grace said to the colonist standing guard at the heavy locking mechanism. The door groaned as it slid aside, and Owen stepped through, quickly scanning the crowded shelter before his eyes settled on Grace. "Grace Bellamy? I'm Sergeant Owen Marsh, Terran Marine Corps. We're here to get you and your people to safety." His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had delivered this kind of reassurance many times before, and Grace felt the tightness in her chest ease for the first time since the alarms had sounded that morning. "Help has arrived," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the uncertainty twisting inside her. "The Terran Marines are here. We just need to hold on a little longer." Above ground, Daniel Ashford led his Marines through the smoke-filled streets of New Halden, moving as quickly as caution allowed toward the shelter entrance. Behind him, the alien commander who had offered an unexpected truce moved alongside a group of its own soldiers, an alliance that felt strange and fragile, but necessary given the threat now bearing down on the colony from the eastern ridge. "Colonel, second group is closing fast," Sophie's voice crackled over the comm. "I'm counting at least 80 hostiles, heavier armor than the first group, and they're not slowing down." Daniel rounded a corner near the colony's central marketplace and got his first clear view of the approaching force. These soldiers moved differently from the ones he had encountered earlier, their formations tighter, their weapons larger, and clearly more advanced. At the front of the group marched a figure even more imposing than the commander who had sought peace, its armor darker, more heavily reinforced, radiating an aura of aggressive purpose that needed no translator to understand. "That's their leader," Daniel said grimly, raising his weapon as his Marines spread into defensive positions around him. "Owen, get your team to the shelter entrance now. Sophie, with me. We hold this line as long as we can." Owen didn't hesitate, leading his squad in a swift, controlled sprint toward the shelter, weapons ready to clear any remaining obstacles in their path. Daniel and Sophie's combined forces, along with the unexpected alien allies, formed a defensive line across the marketplace, bracing for the collision that was only seconds away. Vareth positioned itself near Daniel, its translator device crackling with a final message before the fighting began. "This commander will not listen to reason, only strength. I am sorry, Colonel. This is not how we wish to prove our word." "Then let's prove it together," Daniel replied, gripping his weapon tighter as the approaching enemy line came into full view at the far end of the marketplace. There was no more time for words after that. The two forces closed the distance rapidly, and within moments, the marketplace erupted into chaos once again. The opposing alien commander raised its weapon and unleashed a barrage of energy fire that tore through the marketplace stalls, sending debris flying in every direction. Daniel dove behind an overturned cart, returning fire alongside his Marines as the battle erupted in full force. The plasma cutters proved effective once again, cutting through the heavier armor of the approaching soldiers, though the enemy's advanced weaponry inflicted damage of its own, forcing the defenders to fight for every inch of ground they held. Beside Daniel, the alien commander who had sought peace fought with surprising ferocity against its former allies, clearly determined to prove the sincerity of its earlier words. Daniel found himself fighting alongside a creature he had considered an enemy only minutes earlier, an alliance born from desperate circumstances but proving, moment by moment, to be genuine. "Colonel, shelter is secure. Civilians are being prepared for evacuation," Owen's voice reported over the comm, a small piece of good news amid the chaos. "Copy that," Daniel replied, ducking as another blast of energy fire scorched the ground near his position. "Hold there, and prepare defensive positions. We're going to try to push this second group back, but if we can't hold, get those civilians moving toward the secondary evacuation point." The battle in the marketplace raged on, Marines and unlikely alien allies fighting side by side against the aggressive faction, determined to seize everything New Halden had to offer. Sophie's reconnaissance team provided crucial intelligence, spotting weaknesses in the enemy formation and relaying flanking opportunities that allowed the defenders to slowly gain ground despite being outnumbered. One of Vareth's own soldiers, fighting now alongside the Marines it had attacked only hours earlier, took a direct hit while shielding a young Marine named Corporal Elise Farrow from an incoming blast. The creature staggered but did not fall, its armor scorched but intact, and Elise stared at it for a brief, stunned moment before nodding in silent thanks and returning her focus to the fight. It was a small moment amid the chaos, but one that would stay with her long after the battle ended, a reminder that the lines between enemy and ally had shifted in ways none of them could have predicted that morning. Daniel pressed forward through the fighting, his squad working methodically to close the distance toward the enemy commander, aware that ending this confrontation quickly was the surest way to prevent further loss on both sides. The marketplace, once a peaceful gathering place for the colony's traders and farmers, had become a battlefield scarred with scorch marks and overturned stalls, a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary day could turn into chaos. Then, in the midst of the fighting, the opposing alien commander turned its attention directly toward Daniel. Recognizing him as the leader of the human forces, it advanced with terrifying speed, weapon raised, clearly intent on eliminating the greatest perceived threat on the battlefield. Daniel barely managed to roll aside as a blast of energy struck the ground where he had been standing moments before, the heat of the impact singing the edge of his uniform. He rose quickly, weapon raised, exchanging fire with the approaching commander in a tense, close-range exchange that tested every reflex Daniel had honed over 2 decades of service. The alien commander's armor absorbed several hits without significant damage, and Daniel realized with growing concern that this particular enemy was far better protected than the soldiers they had faced so far. "Colonel, I'm reading a weak point," Sophie's voice cut through urgently. "Base of the neck, where the armor plates connect. It's a smaller target, but it's your best chance." Daniel adjusted his aim, just as the alien commander closed the distance further, weapon raised, for what would likely be a decisive strike. In a split-second decision, Daniel dropped low, sliding beneath the creature's swinging arm, and fired a precise shot directly at the small gap Sophie had identified. The shot connected, and the alien commander staggered back, its weapon clattering to the ground as it clutched at the newly exposed wound. For a tense moment, the battlefield around them seemed to pause, both sides watching to see what would happen next. The wounded commander straightened slowly, its remaining soldiers hesitating, clearly uncertain how to proceed without their leader's direct orders. Daniel kept his weapon raised but did not fire again, watching carefully as the creature swayed unsteadily on its feet. Then, unexpectedly, the wounded commander lowered itself, not in an aggressive stance, but in what appeared unmistakably to be a gesture of surrender. Its long arms extended outward, palms open, weapon left discarded on the ground beside it. The peaceful alien commander who had fought alongside Daniel throughout the battle stepped forward quickly, speaking rapidly through its translator device. It surrenders, says, "Enough fighting," says, "It did not know your kind would fight this way," says, "Mercy, please." Daniel studied the wounded commander for a long moment, aware of his Marines watching him closely, aware of the weight this decision carried, not just for the immediate battle, but for whatever relationship might follow between humanity and this newly encountered species. Around them, the remaining soldiers of the aggressive faction slowly lowered their weapons as well, following their leader's example, the fight draining out of the battlefield as quickly as it had erupted. "Tell them," Daniel said slowly, lowering his own weapon, "that we accept their surrender. No more fighting, no more taking what isn't theirs. If they truly need help, there are better ways to ask for it than through violence." The translator conveyed his words, and the wounded commander bowed its head low, a gesture that seemed to carry genuine relief as much as submission. Around the marketplace, the sounds of battle finally began to fade, replaced by the quieter sounds of smoke settling, and Marines cautiously securing the area, unsure at first whether the sudden calm could truly be trusted. Daniel keyed his comm, his voice carrying across every channel connected to his Marines. "All squads, stand down from offensive engagement. Hostile forces have surrendered. Repeat, hostile forces have surrendered. Maintain defensive positions and secure the area, but hold fire unless directly threatened." A wave of cautious relief spread through the colony as the Marines slowly lowered their weapons, watching the alien soldiers do the same across every position they had fought so fiercely to hold, only moments earlier. Owen's voice came through the comm, tinged with disbelief. "Colonel, are you seeing this? They're actually standing down. All of them." "I see it," Daniel confirmed, still watching the wounded alien commander carefully, aware that trust after violence was fragile and needed to be earned slowly, moment by moment. "Let's get the civilians safely secured, and let's see if we can find a way to actually talk this through, now that everyone's weapons are finally down." Sophie moved carefully through the aftermath, checking on injured Marines and coordinating with the medical teams who had begun arriving from the shuttles to treat the wounded, both human and, cautiously, Corlathi. It was an unusual sight, medics working to stabilize an alien soldier's injuries, only hours after that same soldier had been fighting against them. But no one questioned the decision. Mercy, once extended, seemed to carry its own quiet momentum through the colony. Owen returned from the shelter with word that the civilians were safe, gathered together, and beginning to process the shock of the day's events. He found Daniel near the center of the marketplace, watching as the wounded enemy commander was carefully secured under guard, no longer a threat, but still a symbol of how close the day had come to ending, very differently. "That was closer than I'd like to admit," Owen said quietly, surveying the scorched marketplace around them. "Every fight like this is," Daniel replied. "The difference today is that fewer people died than could have, on both sides. I'll take that as a win, even if it doesn't feel like one yet." As the smoke began to clear across New Halden, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment to look around at the battlefield, Marines and alien soldiers alike beginning the slow, uncertain process of standing together rather than against each other. It was far from a perfect resolution, and he knew there would be difficult conversations ahead, questions about trust, about the true intentions of these desperate travelers who had attacked out of fear and hunger rather than pure malice. But for now, the fighting had stopped, the shelter remained secure, and 400 civilians who had spent the day trapped in fear were finally, cautiously, beginning to breathe easier. The shelter door finally opened, and Grace Bellamy stepped out into the daylight for the first time in hours. blinking against the brightness after so long spent in the dim emergency lighting below ground. Smoke still drifted across parts of the colony, and the marketplace bore the scars of the battle that had raged there only a short while earlier. But the fighting had stopped, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded that morning, New Halden felt quiet. Daniel Ashford approached her as she emerged, his uniform marked with dust and the signs of close combat, but his expression calm and steady despite everything the day had brought. Behind him, Marines worked alongside colony volunteers to check for injuries and begin the process of restoring order, while at a respectful distance, alien soldiers from both factions stood in loose, watchful groups, no longer fighting, but not yet fully at ease either. "Colonel Daniel Ashford," he said, extending a hand toward Grace. "I understand you're the one who sent that distress call." Grace shook his hand, relief and exhaustion mixing plainly across her face. "Grace Bellamy, colony administrator. I honestly wasn't sure anyone would hear it in time." "We heard it," Daniel said simply. "And we came as fast as we could." Behind Grace, the colonists were slowly emerging from the shelter, blinking in the fading light, some embracing loved ones they had been separated from during the chaos, others simply standing still, taking in the sight of their damaged, but still standing home. Ellen Ward stepped out among them, her communication equipment tucked under one arm, her face showing the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the entire day holding a fragile thread of hope together for 400 people who were counting on her. Marcus Doyle limped toward the group, favoring one leg after a difficult scramble through the fighting earlier in the day, but otherwise unharmed. He caught sight of Nathan Cole nearby, and the two men exchanged a brief, exhausted embrace, the kind shared by people who had faced something together and were still trying to process that they had survived it. "I really thought that was it," Marcus admitted quietly, "when that thing walked right past me like I wasn't even there." "We're still here," Nathan said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "That's what matters." Grace looked past him toward the alien soldiers standing at the edge of the marketplace, confusion evident in her expression. "I don't understand. Are they surrendering? Working with you? A few hours ago they were tearing through our supply stores." Daniel gave her a brief summary of what had happened, the unexpected truce with the first alien commander, the desperate plea for help rather than conquest, and the more aggressive faction that had ultimately surrendered after the fierce battle in the marketplace. Grace listened carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to cautious understanding as the pieces of the day's chaos began to fit together. "Their homeworld is dying," Grace repeated softly, glancing again toward the alien soldiers. "That's why they attacked. They were desperate." "Desperation doesn't excuse what they did to your colony," Daniel said, "but it does explain it. And it means there's a chance for something better than continued conflict, if both sides are willing to try." Over the following hours, as the colony worked to recover from the day's chaos, a fragile process of communication began to take shape. Sophie Lang's team worked tirelessly with the alien translator devices, slowly building a more functional method of communication between the two species. The peaceful alien commander, whose name, once properly translated, turned out to be something the human tongue rendered roughly as Verith, proved surprisingly willing to cooperate, eager to demonstrate that its earlier plea for mercy had been genuine. Grace found herself in the unusual position of negotiating, not just for her colony's immediate safety, but for the broader question of what relationship might exist between humanity and this newly encountered species. She sat with Daniel, Verith, and a handful of other key figures from both sides as the details slowly emerged. The aliens called themselves the Korlathi, and their homeworld, once lush and abundant, had been slowly dying for generations, due to a resource crisis their scientists had been unable to solve. Desperate scouting missions had been sent out across the stars, searching for any world that might offer relief, and New Halden, with its abundant water and fertile farmland, had seemed like a lifeline worth any risk. Ellen crouched near Verith with a datapad balanced on her knee, carefully noting down patterns in the alien language as the translator device slowly built a more reliable vocabulary between the two species. Despite everything the day had put her through, she found herself fascinated by the work, aware that she was witnessing something that would likely be studied and remembered for generations to come, the first true conversation between humanity and the Korlathi people. "They didn't know how to ask," Grace said quietly. watching Verith communicate haltingly with Ellen Ward, who had taken a particular interest in learning more about the Korlathi language, despite the exhausting day she had already endured. They only knew how to take, because every other world they'd approached had responded with immediate hostility. "That's not an excuse," Daniel said, though his tone carried more understanding than judgment now. "But it's a reason we can work with. If they're willing to negotiate honestly, instead of attacking, there might be a path forward that doesn't involve more people getting hurt." Verith explained further, its words growing steadier as the translation device adapted to the rhythm of the conversation, that the Korlathi had once been a thriving people, their homeworld rich with the kind of resources that made life comfortable, rather than merely survivable. A slow environmental collapse, one that had taken generations to fully reveal itself, had stripped that abundance away, piece by piece, until entire regions of their world could no longer sustain the population that depended on them. "Our scientists tried many solutions," Verith said. "None worked in time. Our leaders sent scouts outward, searching for worlds that might share what we no longer had. Most returned with nothing. Some did not return at all. When scouts found worlds like yours, desperation had already replaced patience among many of our people." Grace listened closely, feeling a complicated mixture of sympathy and lingering caution. It was one thing to understand why a people might act out of desperation, and another entirely to fully trust that such desperation would not resurface given the right circumstances. Still, she recognized that punishing an already suffering people for their fear would solve nothing, and that the only real path forward involved finding a way to help, without placing New Halden or any other human colony at further risk. The wounded commander from the aggressive faction, whose forces had ultimately surrendered in the marketplace, remained under careful watch throughout the negotiations, still recovering from the injury Daniel had inflicted during their tense confrontation. Verith explained, through the improving translation efforts, that this commander represented a faction among the Korlathi who had grown increasingly desperate and willing to use force without restraint, believing that gentler approaches had already failed too many times to be worth attempting again. "Your mercy," Verith said through the translator, addressing Daniel directly, its clicking language carrying a tone that even without perfect translation felt genuinely humbled, "surprised us. We expected destruction. We expected to be killed for our failure. Instead, you offered a chance to explain, a chance to be heard. This is not what we anticipated from your kind." Daniel considered his response carefully before speaking. "Where I come from, defeating an enemy doesn't mean destroying them completely, especially when that enemy is willing to admit their mistakes and change their approach. Your people are suffering. That doesn't justify what happened here today, but it does mean there might be a better solution than more fighting." As the sun began to set over New Halden, marking the end of a day that had brought unimaginable chaos followed by cautious hope, word arrived that additional Terran fleet vessels were en route, drawn by the reports Daniel had transmitted once the situation had stabilized. Diplomatic officials, scientists, and resource specialists would arrive within days, prepared to properly assess the Korlathi crisis and determine what kind of assistance might genuinely help without compromising the safety or resources of human colonies like New Halden. Sophie Lang spent much of the evening compiling her reconnaissance data into a formal report, aware that whatever she recorded now would shape how future Terran forces approached any encounter with the Korlathi. She worked carefully, documenting not just the weapons and tactics observed during the battle, but also the small human moments that had emerged amid the chaos. The wounded commander's genuine plea for mercy, the Korlathi soldier who had shielded a Marine without hesitation, the awkward but sincere efforts at communication that had followed the fighting. She believed those details mattered just as much as any tactical assessment. Owen, meanwhile, walked the perimeter of the colony with a small squad, checking that the temporary defenses were holding and that both Marines and Korlathi soldiers understood the boundaries that had been agreed upon for the night. It was strange work, coordinating with an enemy turned uncertain ally, but Owen approached it with the same steady professionalism he brought to every task, treating the unusual circumstances as simply another problem to be solved carefully and thoroughly. Henry Voss emerged from the shelter as the evening settled in, having spent the entire ordeal keeping the colony's children calm and distracted through story after story. He found Grace standing near the marketplace, watching as Marines and Korlathi soldiers worked together, however awkwardly, to to begin clearing debris from the day's battle. "Never thought I'd see something like this," Henry said, shaking his head slowly as he took in the strange scene before him. Alien soldiers helping clean up the mess they made, working right alongside the Marines who fought them just hours ago. "It's strange," Grace agreed, "but I'll take strange over more fighting any day." Nearby, Marcus Doyle, still shaken from his earlier encounter with an alien soldier who had walked past him as though he barely existed, found himself in a quiet conversation with one of the Korlathi soldiers, the two of them exchanging simple words and gestures as they worked together to repair a damaged section of fencing near the grain stores. It was a small moment, but one that captured something larger about the day's unexpected turn, the slow, uncertain beginning of understanding between two very different peoples who had started the day as enemies. The Korlathi soldier, through halting gestures and the occasional word from a shared translator passed between them, tried to explain that it had not meant to frighten Marcus earlier that morning, that the soldiers had been under strict orders not to engage civilians directly, unless directly threatened, orders meant to minimize harm, even during an act of desperate theft. Marcus found the explanation only partly comforting, but he appreciated the effort behind it, the willingness to bridge a gap that neither of them had expected to cross in a single day. "Strange thing to say to someone you were robbing," Marcus said, managing a tired, wry smile despite everything. The Korlathi soldier tilted its head in that same curious gesture Daniel had noticed earlier from Vareth, and after a pause, the translator conveyed something that sounded almost like an attempt at humor. "Robbing, badly perhaps. We are not skilled thieves, only desperate ones." Marcus laughed despite himself, a short, surprised sound that felt strange after the day he had endured, but welcome all the same. That evening, as stars began to emerge across the darkening sky above New Halden, Daniel stood near the edge of the colony, looking out over the fields where the day's battle had raged only hours earlier. Owen approached and stood beside him, both men quiet for a long moment, taking in the strange peace that had settled over the colony after such violent chaos. "Didn't expect the day to end like this," Owen said finally. "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. "We came here expecting a straightforward rescue mission. Instead, we found an enemy who turned out to be more desperate than dangerous, and a chance at something better than just another conflict. Think it'll actually work? Peace with them, I mean?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know. There will be difficult conversations ahead, and not everyone on either side will trust this easily, especially after everything that happened today. But I'd rather try for something better than assume the worst and guarantee more fighting." Behind them, the sounds of the colony slowly returning to some semblance of normal life carried on the evening breeze, voices calling out as families reunited, the clatter of supplies being sorted and returned to their proper places, and beneath it all, the quiet hum of cautious cooperation between Marines and Korlathi soldiers working side by side to repair the damage of a day none of them would soon forget. Grace found Daniel later that evening, standing near the shuttle that would eventually carry him and his Marines back to the Horizon's call, once the immediate crisis had been fully stabilized. She approached quietly, watching the stars for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said simply, "for answering our call. For choosing to understand instead of just destroying everything in your path." Daniel offered a small, tired smile. "That's the job, Grace. Not just fighting when fighting is necessary, but knowing when there's a better path available, and having the courage to take it, even when it's harder than simply winning through force." Grace nodded, looking out over her colony, battered but standing, its people frightened but alive, and now facing an uncertain but hopeful future, alongside a species they had never expected to encounter, let alone find common ground with. The distress signal she had sent out in desperation that morning had traveled across the stars, and found not just rescue, but the beginning of something far larger than anyone in New Halden could have imagined when the alarms first sounded. Henry Voss found a quiet spot near the edge of the colony that evening, sitting alone for the first time since the alarms had sounded that morning. He thought about the 15 years he had spent building a life on New Halden, the careful, steady work of turning empty land into a place people could call home, and how quickly all of it had nearly been lost. Yet as he looked out over the colony now, scarred but standing, He felt something unexpected alongside the exhaustion, a quiet sense of gratitude for how the day had ultimately turned out, and cautious hope for what might come next. Grace found him there a short while later, and the two sat together in comfortable silence for a while, before she finally spoke. "Do you think this will actually work? Peace with them, I mean, in the long run?" Henry considered the question carefully before answering. The same steady thoughtfulness he had shown the children throughout the day's crisis now turned toward the larger uncertainty ahead. "I don't know, but I think today proved something important. Even after everything, we still had a choice in how we responded, and we chose to try understanding before assuming the worst. That has to count for something, whatever comes next." As night fully settled over the colony, the Marines began preparing for their return to the Horizon's call, their mission far from over, but the most immediate crisis finally resolved. Above New Halden, the twin suns had set, giving way to a sky full of stars, silent witnesses to a day that had begun with terror and ended, against every expectation, with the fragile, precious beginning of peace between worlds.